As Voltaire laid on his deathbed, a priest came and inquired as to whether Voltaire would finally denounce the devil. A reply came, "This is no time to make new enemies." Perhaps that'll give you some kind of hint at what kind of person Voltaire was. Born in 1694 in Paris, he was a towering figure of the Enlightenment, known for his sharp wit and staunch advocacy of civil liberties, including free speech, religious tolerance, and of course, the separation of church and state. His extensive body of work, including plays, poems, novels, essays, and over 20,000 letters, shaped the intellectual landscape of his time. Often at odds with French authorities due to his critical and for the time controversial views, he faced imprisonment and exile. Yet through it all, he remained a vocal proponent of human rights until his death in 1778. And to this very day, he is celebrated as a cultural hero in Paris, especially during his final years, and carries a legacy that continues to influence modern democratic ideals and the global discourse on liberty and equality. Welcome to the channel, friends. Going to talk about Voltaire today. Perhaps a bit of a selfish topic choice. I've been looking forward to it, perhaps more than anybody else has. But we are here now, so strap yourself in. It's going to be a long one, as usual. Of course, if you have something interesting to say, you may as well say it in the comments, because it all helps the engagement. I don't need to tell you what to do if you like the content. Just click the 2 buttons and you'll get more of it. Like and subscribe. You know how it is. Now, with the customary begging out of the way, I'll pick myself up off the ground and we can begin. So, we start with a different name. Not Voltaire, but François-Marie Arouet, who was born in Paris as the youngest of 5 children to François Arouet, a lawyer and minor treasury official, and his mother, Marie-Marguerite d'Amade, who hailed from a family of lower French nobility, but nobility nonetheless. Now remember, the name Voltaire will be used later on, so we will be referring to him in some context as François-Marie Arouet. Don't get confused. Same person. Now what about his actual birth date? Well, as is the style of the time, it's a little bit uncertain. But if you were to ask Voltaire, and people did, he would claim that he was born on February 20th, 1694. But he also would suggest that he was the illegitimate son of a nobleman, Guérin de Rochebrune. But that is not confirmed. We do know that 2 of his elder brothers, Armand Francois and Robert, died in infancy, and this left only his brother Armand and his sister Marguerite Catherine, who were significantly older than him. Now, there's a 3rd name. He was affectionately known as Zozo within his family, which is quite cute. And he was baptized November 22nd, 1694. He received an early education from the Jesuits at the Collège Louis-le-Grand between 1704 and 1711, and reportedly was quite a good study. He excelled in theology, Latin, and later became fluent in Italian, Spanish, and English. Quite an impressive sheet. But what he was really good at was rhetoric. He could talk himself in and out of anything, a natural gift, certainly one that comes in handy especially if you're putting your hand to writing. But his father, well, he had other plans. And like many other fathers who had the money to send their kids to school, he wanted him to have a career that would justify that financial sacrifice. And the go-to was being a lawyer. Of course, Voltaire was not as excited about this prospect as his father was. He wanted to be a writer. Now, isn't that just a tale as old as time? So many people going off to university to study things that their parents see no value in. But who knows? Maybe the next Voltaire, the next Martin Luther, the next J.R.R. Tolkien. Perhaps they're off studying literature now and writing to the chagrin of their parents, and we don't even know it. Do what you want with your life. Now, he did have to keep them happy. Keep up appearances, at least. Being good to your parents is, of course, a virtue. So he simply pretended to work as a notary's assistant in Paris, just to keep the hounds at bay for a little while. But he was still dedicating much of his time to writing poetry, his true passion. Of course, he could only keep the ruse up for some time, and eventually his father discovered what he was really doing. So, immediately, he sent him to Cannes to study law. Unfortunately, this did not deter him from continuing to write. Unfortunately, when you have an angsty teenager, it only makes them want to pursue these sorts of creative outlets even more. Voltaire's wit and humour soon gained him favour among the aristocratic circles, however, who took quite a liking to him, and in 1713 his father arranged for him to work as a secretary to the French ambassador in the Netherlands, the Marquis de Chateauneuf. During his time there, Voltaire became involved with a French Protestant refugee, Catherine Olympe de Noailles, known affectionately as Pimpette. Of course, the affair caused a scandal, because what is the 18th century without a good scandal? And Voltaire was ordered to return to France by the end of that year. Voltaire spent much of his early life in Paris, where he quickly ran afoul of the authorities due to his very open and equally sharp criticisms of the government. His satirical writings led to 2 prison sentences, one which was an 11-month stint in the Bastille in 1717, following the publication of a poem accusing the regent of incest. I'm sure the regent did not see the humour in that one. Well, despite all the setbacks, Voltaire's first play, Oedipe, debuted in November 1718, shortly after his release, and it achieved critical and, most importantly, financial success. But of course, with success comes a reputation, and his growing reputation actually earned him medals from both the Regent and King George I of Great Britain, who were perhaps a little bit more on board with his criticisms of the French. Now, throughout his career, Voltaire championed the causes of religious tolerance and intellectual freedom. He was a staunch critic of both ecclesiastical and aristocratic power, advocating for a constitutional monarchy that would protect individual rights and promote justice, a very novel idea for the time. Now, around this time is when he adopted this pseudonym Voltaire, around 1718, when he got out of that horrible dungeon in the Bastille. The exact origin of this name is actually a bit of a mystery, but there is a theory among few that is somewhat prevailing. One theory is that it serves as an anagram of Arouet Lee, derived from a Latinized version of his surname Arouet, combined with the letters of Lejeune, meaning the young. Another explanation comes from a family tradition, suggesting that Arouet was referred to as le petit volontaire, determined little thing, during his childhood, which may have influenced his later choice of the name. Additionally, the name Voltaire inverts the syllables of Herval, the town in the Poitou region from which his family hailed. Now, enough about the name. In a letter to Jean-Baptiste Rousseau in March of 1719, Voltaire explained his decision to change his name, quoting, "I was so discontented under the name Arouet that I adopted another, chiefly to avoid being conflated with the poet Roi." This remark likely refers to Adonis Le Roi, whose name sounded similar to Arouet. I don't know how, but that's just how French works. Now, over his lifetime, Voltaire is known to have used at least 178 different pseudonyms, reflecting his versatility and playfulness with identity. But of course, we're not going to list all of them. We simply do not have the time, and neither of us have the patience, let's be honest. Now, we already remarked about the success of his play as soon as he got out of the Bastille. Well, of course, you always double down when an idea is working. So, Voltaire's next play, Artemisia, set in ancient Macedonia, premiered on February 15, 1720. Unfortunately, this was not like the first. It was a complete failure, and we only have fragments of the play that survive, so we can't really read through it and try and figure out what exactly the content was, but we do know that it wasn't much worth saving. Either way, following the setback, Voltaire rolled up his sleeves and turned his attention to an epic poem about King Henry IV of France, which was a project that he had begun earlier in 1717. In August of 1722, after being refused permission to publish his poem in France, Voltaire travelled north with his mistress, Marie Marguerite du Rupelmonde, a young widow, in search of a publisher outside the country. And in his travels, he eventually landed in Brussels, where he briefly met with Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, before continuing his journey northward with his lover, Rupelmonde. Voltaire eventually found a publisher for his work, La Henriade, in The Hague, during which time in the Netherlands he was struck by the openness and religious tolerance of the Dutch society, which was a sharp contrast with the restrictive environment in France. Upon his return to his home country, he secured a second publisher in Rouen, who agreed to publish La Henriade clandestinely. After recovering from a bout of smallpox in November 1723, the first copies of the poem were secretly transported to Paris and distributed. Of course, with the controversy, the poem quickly garnered acclaim, but Voltaire's play, Mariam, failed once again. It premiered to a very lackluster reception in the March of 1724. Well, not to give up on the dream of a good work, a heavily revised version of the play was staged at the Comédie Française in April of 1725, and with a few quick little edits, a little snip there, add a little here, take a little from there, it actually achieved a much greater success, and was performed as part of the wedding festivities of Louis XV in September of that year. Now we move onwards to the next year, early 1726, when a personal conflict arose between Voltaire and the noble Chevalier de Rohan Chabot, who actually mocked Voltaire's change of name. Voltaire retorted that his name would be known worldwide, while Rowan would disgrace his own. Hard to argue with him. Nobody knows who Rowan de Chabot is. Well, of course, Rowan was outraged, and he arranged for Voltaire to be beaten by his henchmen. That's right, sending the boys out to give him a right thrashing. Of course, Voltaire was a bit more of a gentleman than that. Solved the problem man to man, so he sought to challenge Rowan to a duel. But Rowan was a bit of a coward. The family instead had Voltaire arrested and thrown back into the Bastille on the 17th of April 1726. Of course, your second stay at the Bastille is, well, probably a little bit less pleasant than the first one, and that's saying something. There was this fear of indefinite imprisonment. You're never getting out. And because of this, Voltaire requested an alternative punishment: exile to England. Very brave. Now, the French authorities actually accepted the request. Somebody else's problem. Let's send him overseas. So, on the 2nd of May 1726, Voltaire was escorted to Calais and boarded a ship bound for his new home. Now, during his exile in England, he primarily resided in Wandsworth and later in Covent Garden to be closer to his publisher. His time in England was transformative as he mingled with intellectuals and aristocrats, including Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, John Gay, and Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. The period exposed him to these ideas of constitutional monarchy, free speech, and even religious tolerance, concepts that were completely in contrast with the absolutism of the French. At least for now. Things would change, and they would very much drastically change. Much due to Voltaire. But we'll get to that. Now, Voltaire became fascinated too with English literature, particularly Shakespeare, despite critiquing the playwright for breaking classical norms. He reportedly appreciated the energy and action in Shakespeare's works, which he had said were quite lacking in the French drama. Voltaire may have also attended Sir Isaac Newton's funeral, and perhaps even met Newton's niece, Catherine Candide. His intellectual engagements with British society led to the publication of 2 essays in English in 1627, namely titled Upon the Civil Wars of France, extracted from curious manuscripts, and Upon the Epic Poetry of the European Nations, from Homer down to Milton. He also wrote about the Quakers, after observing one of their services, expanding his views on religious tolerance. After 2.5 years in exile, Voltaire returned to France, initially residing in Dieppe. He was eventually permitted to come back to Paris, albeit with no doubt a few apprehensions from the upper class. And during this period, he became involved in a profitable lottery scheme suggested by the mathematician Charles-Marie de la Condamine, which allowed Voltaire to amass a considerable fortune. This financial success, combined with his prudent investments, convinced the French court of finances of his responsibility, granting him control over his inheritance. Voltaire's success continued with the 1732 release of his play Zaire, followed by the publication of his Letters Concerning the English Nation in 1733, a work that praised British governance, liberty, and their religious tolerance. In 1734, the essays were published in France, causing outrage due to their critical comparisons of the British and French systems. The French government deemed the work a threat resulting in the public burning of the book and a warrant for Voltaire's arrest. If there's one thing that the French do not like, it's being told that the English do something better than they do. Well, due to this, he fled Paris once again, pitchforks and torches raging behind his back, seeking refuge with Émilie du Châtelet, a mathematician and philosopher with whom he would share a 16-year friendship. Now Voltaire and Émilie took residence in her husband's chateau in Cirey, near Champagne-Lorraine border. Voltaire financed the renovations of the chateau, which became a hub of intellectual activity, and everybody was invited. In fact, it was that much of a little university unto itself that they amassed a vast library of, wait for it, 21,000 books. Now that would be impressive, even for our modern standards. Back then, very, very impressive. But despite the unconventional nature of their relationship, Emily's husband occasionally joined them, fostering a unique intellectual partnership. Having learned from his previous clashes with authorities, Voltaire adopted a strategy of avoiding direct confrontations, often distancing himself from accountability when necessary. Good strategy. Well, despite this cautious approach, he continued his prolific output of plays. Nothing was going to stop him, including the work Merope, and he also pursued extensive studies in science and history, all of those books getting put to good use. In 1735, Voltaire and Émilie du Châtelet, with whom he shared both intellectual and personal ties, welcomed Francesco Algarotti, who was working on an Italian book about Isaac Newton, of whom Voltaire was a great admirer. In fact, he was deeply enamored by all of these ideas of Sir Isaac Newton, and he passionately promoted Newton's scientific theories, even conducting optical experiments of his own. Well, of course, inspired by this visit, Émilie translated Newton's Principia into French, a translation that remains the authoritative French version to this very day. They haven't changed it much in almost 300 years. Pretty impressive. Now, while Voltaire remained firmly aligned with Newtonian science, Émilie was more open to the elements of Leibniz's philosophy, which critiqued Newton's ideas. Just a scientific critique, not a poison rivalry, as we could put it that way. Well, together, they played pivotal roles in advancing Newton's theories in France, helping to shift the intellectual climate away from the Cartesian tradition that had long dominated the French scientific circles. In 1736, Voltaire's reputation drew the attention of Frederick the Great, the then Crown Prince of Prussia, who initiated a correspondence with him. By December of that year, Voltaire had traveled to Holland, where he met scientists Herman Boerhaave and Willem Gravesand. Over the next few years, he frequently visited Brussels, initially accompanying Émilie as she sought to resolve a protracted family legal dispute. In 1740, Voltaire traveled to The Hague on behalf of Frederick, who had become king, to prevent the unauthorized publication of the Anti-Machiavel, Frederick's critique of Machiavelli. That same year, Voltaire and Frederick met for the first time at Moyland Castle. This encounter marked the beginning of I suppose we can call it a complex relationship that would see Voltaire serve as both the confidant but also the critic of the Prussian king. Now, in 1743, Voltaire was sent by the French government themselves to Frederick's court as a covert envoy and observer. His mission was to assess Frederick's military intentions during the War of the Austrian Succession, a task that demonstrated Voltaire's growing involvement in diplomatic and political matters. Call it whatever you want, it seemed like a spy job to me. Well, despite his profound dedication to the Marquise, Voltaire, by 1744, perceived life at her chateau as restrictive. During a visit to Paris later that year, he discovered a new affection. His niece. I struggle to say it. Well, times are different. Initially, his allure towards Marie-Louis Mignot was distinctly sexual, as demonstrated by his correspondence with her, which was only uncovered in 1957, by the way. They found the dirty letters. Subsequently, they did cohabitate, possibly in a platonic manner, but probably not, and remained together until Voltaire's death. Concurrently, the Marquise engaged in an affair with the Marquise de Saint-Lambert. After the death of Émilie du Châtelet in September 1749, Voltaire briefly returned to Paris, but soon moved back to Prussia in mid-1750, as he was invited by Frederick the Great himself, and one can hardly turn down such an invitation. You see, the Prussian king, with the approval of Louis XV, appointed Voltaire as a chamberlain, inducted him into the Order of Merit, and provided him with an annual salary of 20,000 French livres. Voltaire lived in Frederick's palaces at Charlottenburg and Sanssouci, and initially they were getting along just fine. But during this period, Voltaire also completed Micromegas, a scientific fiction work exploring humanity's absurdities through the eyes of extraterrestrial beings. May I not have to remind you how ahead of its time this was? Thinking about those sorts of things all the way back then, definitely interesting. However, there were tensions that arose when the Jewish financier Abraham Herschel accused Voltaire of theft and forgery in connection with an investment in Saxon government bonds. This occurred during a sensitive diplomatic period between Prussia and Saxony, worsening Voltaire's standing with Frederick. Additionally, Voltaire's quarrel with Maupertuis, the president of the Berlin Academy of Science, over scientific disputes and personal animosities, further strained the relationship. These things, out in public, they're never good. Well, Voltaire published a satirical pamphlet around this time as well, which mocked Maupertuis, and that also angered Frederick even more, who was apparently a good friend. Perhaps they had some other interests financially. Well, due to this, the king flew off the handle, and he ordered all copies of the pamphlet to be burned. Of course, Voltaire, the writing was on the wall for him. He resigned his position in January of 1752. Frederick, after some hesitation, did accept his resignation in March of the same year. So, tail between his legs, hands deeply in his pockets, off he went back to France. But on the way, he made a few stops: Leipzig, Gotha, Kassel, and eventually he reached Frankfurt in May. Now, in Frankfurt, he didn't have a very pleasurable stay. He was detained by Frederick's agents over a dispute about a satirical poetry book the king had actually lent to him. He was held in Frankfurt for more than 3 weeks, during which time his luggage was looted and his niece, Marie-Louise, had to fend off the advances of one of Frederick's agents. The situation ended with Voltaire and his niece leaving Frankfurt in July, no doubt deeply embittered by the experience. Now, Voltaire's attempts to tarnish Frederick's reputation following the incident were more or less unsuccessful, despite his posthumous memoir, where he alluded to Frederick's homosexuality. Well, despite all the differences, the two men reconciled after the 7 Years' War, though they never met again in person. Now, after being barred from Paris by Louis XV in 1754, Voltaire moved to Geneva, where he purchased an estate in 1755. Initially welcomed by the city, which was Calvinist in their beliefs, his relationship with the local authorities, guess what, soured again. Now, why was this? It was mainly due to Geneva's prohibition on theatre and the unauthorized publication of The Maid of Orleans. Of course, Voltaire was all about freedom, and he wanted it, so he acquired a larger estate in Ferney, just across the French border, in 1758, and the town eventually renamed itself Ferney-Voltaire in his honor. Seems he was a little bit more welcome in this one. Now, in 1759, Voltaire published Candide, his most famous work, a biting satire on Leibniz's philosophy of optimistic determinism. He would spend most of the next 20 years at Ferney, hosting a stream of prominent intellectuals, including Adam Smith, James Boswell, Edward Gibbon, the guy who wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and even Lock Up Your Daughters, Giacomo Casanova. Whoop-de-doo. I'm sure he was great to have at a party. Well, in 1764, he published the Dictionary of Philosophy, a collection of articles that criticized Christian doctrine and history, much of which he had written during his time in Berlin. He remained at Ferney for the rest of his life, becoming a central figure in the Enlightenment movement. So, let's go a few years back from the publish of the Dictionary of Philosophy. We begin in 1762, and at this time he emerged as an unparalleled intellectual luminary, advocating for individuals who were unjustly persecuted, most notably the Huguenot merchant Jean Calais. Now, Calais was tortured to death in 1763, allegedly for murdering his eldest son, who sought to convert to Catholicism. His belongings were seized, and his 2 daughters were removed from their widow mother and compelled to enter Catholic covenants. Voltaire, perceiving this as a definitive instance of religious persecution, successfully overthrew the conviction in 1765, and that is not an easy feat back for those days. Now, in February of 1778, Voltaire briefly returned to Paris for the first time over 25 years, partially to witness the premiere of his latest tragedy, Irene. The 5-day expedition proved excessive for the 83-year-old, a little bit too much for him, who felt that he was nearing death on the 28th of February, stating, "I die adoring God, loving my friends, not hating my enemies, and detesting superstition." Well, he didn't actually die. He actually recuperated. In March, he attended a performance of Irene, where the audience regarded him as kind of like this returning hero, which I guess he kind of was. Well, he wasn't around to play the hero for too much longer. Subsequently fell ill once again and passed away on the 30th of May, 1778. The accounts of his deathbed were of course numerous and varied, making it pretty impossible to ascertain the precise details of what transpired. But I did give you that little hint at the start of the video, where his adversaries claimed that he expressed remorse and received last rites from a Catholic priest, or that he perished in torment of body and soul. But of course his supporters recounted his defiance until his final breath, including the aforementioned account when the priest implored him to disavow Satan himself, giving the response, "This is no time to make new enemies." Pretty cool, I think. Now, speaking of cool, we're going to talk all about Voltaire's writings and his views on life, his philosophies, all these sorts of things. Of course, we're going to start with primarily his private correspondence, which often implores the reader to crush the infamous. It is an expression that denotes simultaneous abuses of authority by monarchical and ecclesiastical powers, as well as the superstition and intolerance that was incited by the clergy. He had, in his time, witnessed and experienced these consequences during his own exiles. The incineration of his books and those of numerous others, as well as the heinous persecution of Jean Calas and François-Jean de la Barre. He articulated in one of his most renowned quotations that superstition sets the entire world ablaze. Philosophy extinguishes it. That's a pretty good one, isn't it? Now, the most frequently referenced quotation attributed to him is somewhat apocryphal. He's mistakenly attributed with the statement, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Sorry to disappoint you, those were not actually his words, but those of Evelyn Beatrice Hall, penned under the pseudonym S.G. Tallentire in her 1906 biographical work, The Friends of Voltaire. So it's easy to get them confused. Now, Voltaire's inaugural significant philosophical work in his struggle against the infamy was the Traité sur la tolérance, the treatise on tolerance, which elucidated the Calas affair and highlighted the tolerance exhibited by various faiths and civilizations throughout history, including the Romans, Greeks, Jews, and Chinese. Now, in his Dictionary on Philosophy, which include entries such as Abraham, Genesis, and Church Council, he articulated his views on the human origins of dogmas and beliefs, along with the inhumane actions of religious and political institutions in their violent conflicts over rival sects. Voltaire, among other targets, criticized France's colonial policy in North America, referring to it as the extensive territory of New France as a few acres of snow. Doesn't really sound like much worth fighting for, and I think that's what he was trying to put across. Of course, similar to other prominent Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire adhered to deism. Now, he questioned conventional beliefs by inquiring what constitutes faith. Is it reasonable to accept that which is apparent? It is abundantly clear to me that a necessary, eternal, supreme, and intelligent being exists. This is a matter of reason, not faith. In a 1763 essay, Voltaire advocated for the tolerance of diverse religions and ethnicities, asserting it does not necessitate great skill or eloquent rhetoric to demonstrate that Christians ought to tolerate one another. I assert that we ought to consider all individuals our brethren. What is it? Is the Turk my brother? Is the individual of Chinese descent, my brother, the Jew? Is it the Siam? Indeed, without question, are we not all children of the same progenitor and creations of the same God? Then, speaking of God, of which he spoke of quite extensively, in a correspondence to Frederick the Great, dated the 5th of January, 1767, he addressed the topic of Christianity. And I quote from the letter, "Ours, i.e. the Christian religion, is assuredly the most ridiculous, the most absurd, and most bloody religion that has ever infected this world. Your Majesty will do the human race an eternal service by extirpating this infamous superstition. I do not say among the rabble, who are not worthy of being enlightened, and who are apt for every yoke. I say among the honest people, among men who think, among those who wish to think. My one regret in dying is that I cannot aid you in this noble enterprise, the finest and most respectable which the human mind can point out." Jeez, tips fedora. Well, in another letter, he articulated the following perspective on laypersons reading the Bible. It is characteristic of fanatics who read the Holy Scriptures to tell themselves, God killed, so I must kill. Abraham lied, Jacob deceived, Rachel stole, so I must steal, deceive, lie. But, wretch, you are neither Rachel, nor Jacob, nor Abraham, nor God. You are just a mad fool. And the popes who forbade the reading of the Bible were extremely wise. Now do remember, just for a bit of context, the reading of the Bible was not so common before it was translated. Martin Luther came along and translated it into German, and then everybody else translated it into their own vernacular. But before that, it was all in Latin. The priests would give you the exact interpretation. Of course, after everybody had access to reading the Bible, they began to think a little bit more about how to interpret it themselves. And then they had to set the Inquisition up for all the heresies. Well, that's a very different topic. Well, nonetheless, Voltaire recognized this selflessness of Christians, and he stated in another letter, "There may be no greater sacrifice on earth than that of youth and beauty, frequently from noble lineage, rendered by the gentler sex, to serve in hospitals for the alleviation of human suffering, which is often repugnant to our sensibilities." He also stated, "Those who can instill absurd beliefs can compel you to perpetuate atrocities." This initial assault targeted that clericalism and theocracy, and culminated in this vehement attack on Holy Scripture, church dogmas, and even on Jesus Christ himself, who Voltaire portrayed as a complete degenerate. But of course, in the spirit of equal opportunity, and we're all about equality, so was Voltaire, it wasn't just the Christians who were taking a beating in his writings. We can't leave the Jews out, can't we? And Voltaire remarked that the Jews, I quote, "have exceeded all nations in audacious fables, immoral behavior, and in barbarism. You merit punishment. This is your fate." He additionally stated, "They are all inherently imbued with fervent fanaticism akin to how Bretons and Germans are naturally endowed with blonde hair. I would not at all be surprised if these individuals eventually pose a lethal threat to humanity." Not a very good review of Judaism either. Well, Voltaire denounced persecution of Jews multiple times, though, notably in Henriade, and he consistently opposed violence or assaults against them. You wouldn't think he would from that tirade, but, well, he did. Now, In his later writings, he vehemently criticized the ancient Hebrews. That was his main problem. Isaac de Pinto criticized the so-called anti-Semitic passages in Voltaire's Dictionary of Philosophy in 1762. And of course, Voltaire subsequently acknowledged the criticism, asserting that de Pinto's letter persuaded him of the existence of highly intelligent and cultivated individuals among the Jews. He also admitted to having been mistaken in attributing the vices of a few to an entire nation, and pledged to amend the objectionable passages in future editions of the Dictionary of Philosophy. However, when these future editions were published, they were all exactly the same. He did not amend anything. Oh well, it's his book. Well, we continue into the big three, and we get to Islam, of which, shock and horror, Voltaire held a very negative view of, perceiving its holy text, the Quran, as lacking in understanding of the principles of physics. There was a letter dated 1740 to Frederick the Great, and Voltaire attributes a brutality to Muhammad that is assuredly nothing any man can excuse. And he suggests that the following: all things around Islam just arose simply from superstition. He also elaborates, I quote, "But that a camel merchant should incite insurrection in his village, that, in collusion with some wretched adherents, he convinces them he converses with the angel Gabriel, that he boasts of having ascended to heaven, where he partially received this incomprehensible book, each page of which induces common sense to recoil, that in reference to this book he subjects his country to devastation, that he slaughters fathers and abducts daughters, that he offers the vanquished the choice of his religion or death. This is assuredly nothing any man can excuse, unless he was born a Turk, or if superstition has obliterated all natural reason within him." Well, that's not all. In 1748, after studying Henri de Boulainvilliers and George Sale, he authored On the Quran and on Muhammad, revisiting the subjects of Muhammad and Islam. Now in this essay, Voltaire asserted that Muhammad was a, quote, divine, or rather sublime charlatan. According to René Pomeau, Voltaire, referencing complementary information from Herbelot's Oriental Library, deemed the Quran to be, I quote, rhapsody without connection, without order, and without art, citing its contradictions, absurdities, anachronisms. Consequently, he thereafter acknowledged that if his book was detrimental to our era and to us, it was highly beneficial for his contemporaries, and his religion even more so. It must be acknowledged that he eradicated nearly all idolatry from Asia, and that a straightforward and sagacious religion propagated a consistently triumphant individual was likely to fail in subjugating a segment of the world. He opined that its civil laws are commendable, its dogma praiseworthy, sharing similarities with ours, yet he asserted that its methods were appalling, characterized by deception and murder. Voltaire consistently characterized Muhammad as an impostor, a false prophet, a fanatic, and a hypocrite. In his play, Muhammad embodies the most egregious trickery and the most terrifying fanaticism. He is merely a Tartuffe with military forces at his disposal. subsequently having concluded that he portrayed Muhammad in his play somewhat nastier than he truly was. Voltaire asserted that Muhammad appropriated the concept of an angel weighing both men and women from Zoroastrians commonly known as magi. He elaborated on Islam, saying, and I quote, "Nothing is more terrible than a people who, having nothing to lose, fight in the united spirit of rapine and religion." Now that's something to think about. But what about Hindus? Did they get off easy? Well, let's find out. So in regards to the Hindu sacred text, the Vedas, Voltaire wrote, "The Veda was the most precious gift for which the West has ever been indebted to the East." Not bad. In fact, he perceived Hindus as a tranquil and naive populace, equally unable to harm others or to protect themselves. He advocated for animal rights, by the way, and he adhered to a vegetarian diet. Well, that probably puts him squarely in the Hindu camp. He leveraged the antiquity of Hinduism to deliver what he perceived as a significant refutation of the Bible's assertions, and recognized that the Hindus' treatment of animals presented a morally superior alternative to the immorality of the European imperialists. Now, what about the other Eastern religions? Well, he wrote about Confucianism too, and this is what he said. "Confucius has no interest in falsehood. He did not pretend to be a prophet. He claimed no inspiration. He taught no new religion. He used no delusions. Flattered not the emperor under whom he lived." No. In general, he lauded Confucian ethics and politics, depicting China's socio-political hierarchy as a kind of paradigm for Europe. Of course, they were very lucky to get a Latin account of Confucius's life and work in 1687 written by Father Prospero Introqueta, which was later on translated into different languages. Now, the translation that we're talking about of Confucian text during the Enlightenment introduced this concept of meritocracy to Western intellectuals, who regarded it as an alternative to the traditional regimes of Europe. Voltaire more or less expressed a positive view of the concept, asserting that the Chinese had perfected moral science, and promoting an economic and political system based upon the Chinese model. Well, with that, we could talk all day about Voltaire's opinions on different things, and what he liked, what he didn't like, what he deemed respectable, and what he deemed quite horrid. But maybe I'll do a more thorough reading of some of his texts. That could be fun. Well, with that, we reach the end of the life and works of Voltaire. And I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons: Dark, Gary, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Star Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizarbo, Legitmus, Maverick, and Susan. Thank you very much. Always appreciate everybody who's supporting the channel, but of course you're just supporting by watching it. And know that I will still be here for you tomorrow if you feel like coming back, or if you feel like watching something else. I don't know. Whatever you want to do. I will see you at your next available convenience. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.